Earnings expectations of the S&P 500. Look at the S&P, again, a decline of about 2.2%. If you're looking at others, at all sorts of estimates, they're going to be down. That's the guesstimate there, as much as 5%, as little as 1.5%, but they're going to be down. That's the expectation. Stanford School of Business lecturer Dave Dodson on why he thinks that might be the case. What do you think?
Well, I think there's a lot of evidence that the economy is softening. We tend to look at these two things. We look at the jobs report, right, and then we look at the GDP growth rate. But that's all things that's happened in the past. But there's a lot of clues in these reports that tell you about what's going to happen in the future. So, for example, when I get the jobs report, one of the things I look at is overtime. So corporate overtime hours that are being offered to employees is down by almost 10% this year. You know, that's really an indication of some softening in the economy. The GDP growth rate, I mean, that's just kind of a fancy way of saying how much stuff we're buying. Well, if you want to know how much stuff we're going to be buying next month, look at how consumers are paying for the things they bought this month. And if you look at default rates on auto loans, if you look at credit card balances, if you look at the percent of people who are paying off their credit cards, all of that's indicating that people are starting to struggle with paying for the things that they bought this year.
Before I extend this to my panelists here who are eager to talk to you, Dave, one of the things that's come up is the uncertainty of trade, that a lot of companies don't know how to handicap that, so they just put it out there as potential headwinds they're facing, and they've been sort of battening down the financial hatches. What do you think of it?
It's really dreadful for these companies that have complex manufacturing supply chains. I mean, these are supply chains that got created over decades, and they're very intricate, and now they're being sort of dismantled in ways that are very disruptive. Now, in the short term, they're disruptive economically because everything becomes more expensive. And then you add tariffs on top of it. You know, that's going to have a lot of negative pressure on earnings. But long term, you know, what business likes, and everybody knows this, what business likes is they like certainty. They like to know what's going to happen. And there is so much uncertainty happening in Washington, D.C. I mean, it's maddening for companies.
Dave, this is Paul Dietrich, and in looking at that jobs report, it seemed like a lot of the overtime going down came out of manufacturing. And manufacturing is only 10% of the U.S. economy. 70% of the U.S. economy is consumer spending, and, you know, jobs are still growing. Wages are still growing. I think next quarter is going to be really good. That's usually the consumer quarter. And so I was wondering whether we put too much emphasis. There's no question that manufacturing is in decline, but that overtime, I agree with you. The overtime shows where we're going, but I think it shows more where we're going in manufacturing than in the overall economy. What do you think?
Well, Paul, I agree with you. You can't just look at manufacturing. The number that I looked at lines up with what you were thinking, which is it's the total overtime, both service, mining, manufacturing. So I was looking at the total number, which came down by 9.5%. But the income is also an interesting number because, you know, we tend to look at the income as the change in the wage rate. But what's really important for a wage earner is what their paycheck looks like, right? And if they're getting less overtime, and by the way, number of hours has come down so far this year, their paycheck is smaller, and that's lost in those numbers of what the wage rates are. And so if I am a shift worker at Best Buy, or I work in a mine, and my wages went up by 6% this year, but the number of overtime hours that I got were dropped by 10%, that's a reduction in my income.
I thought in that report that they actually said that most, not all of it certainly, but the decline in overtime was primarily in the manufacturing sector. It was certainly overweighted.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, it's a maddeningly difficult report because there's 30 different line items there. And when I was looking at the line items, it looked to me like there were two places that were getting hit hard. One was manufacturing, Paul, as you said, but the other was in the service sector.
Hi, Dave. It's Jeannie Zaino. I wanted to ask you, if the news we're hearing today about, say, we do get a short-term deal out of the administration vis-a-vis China, how much would that change sort of your forecast in terms of what you expect to see in the next quarter or next year?
Well, Jeannie, it's interesting you asked that way because my feeling in the next quarter or next year would be optimistic. I think everybody would breathe a massive sigh of relief, and we could sort of get back to business as usual, and I think there would be more political stability. However, my worry is, what is that long term? Because I can't see a world right now where China is going to be making painful concessions to the United States right now. Because given our political situation and given that we have an election coming up, I can't imagine why China would make those kind of concessions. So what I worry about is not the next quarter, next year, but I worry about maybe what's going to happen in the next decade with that trade relationship. And of course, that's what the president has been focused so hard on, is trying to fix the long-term relationship between the United States economy and the Chinese economy.
So, hi, David. It's David Dietz. As we say on Wall Street, it's not just a market, it's a market of sectors. So are there some sectors that you're a little bit more optimistic on and others that you're more cautious on?
Well, I don't really have, that's a fair question, David. I really don't have a point of view on which sectors might go up or down over the next quarter or so. But here's an issue that I am, speaking of sectors, here's an issue that I am sort of interested in, which is, if there's a recession or if there's a downturn, we know that all downturns aren't the same. So in 2008, it hit the homeowners who had mortgages. It hit them disproportionately hard because they had big mortgages. This downturn is likely to hit 18 to 30-year-olds disproportionately hard because the student loan rate is 183% of what it was before. So here's the interesting sort of political economic cocktail that we may be staring down. One is, if there's a downturn or a recession, it's going to hit them way harder. By the way, their unemployment rate is 4 times the national average. It's going to hit them harder. That's piece number one. Piece number two is, over the last 10 years, that sector has become very disenchanted with the system. And in fact, the favorability of capitalism among that group has gone from 64% in 10 years down to 45%. So they don't believe in the system. Now, here's the last piece. Tufts University just recently released some interesting data about student voting. Student voting in the midterm elections in 2018 doubled from 19% to 40%. It doubled. So now you've got a cohort going into the 2020 election who have a very different viewpoint on the economic policy, and it's more far left economic policy. I actually think that that could translate into U.S. policy over the next 4 to 8 years.
I don't know what's more remarkable there, Dave, that a guy from Stanford is quoting a Tufts survey, or that we have to really worry about that. Always good having you, Professor. Thank you for taking the time.